recording now.
Yes.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to today's talk. Let me very quickly introduce Riot's Science Club first, especially for those of you that are joining for the very first time. We host weekly seminars that aim to provide training in reproducible, interpretable, open, and transparent science. And all of Riot Science Club events are free and open to everyone. And we are also recording always our talks that are later on posted on our YouTube channel. So please check out our Twitter feeds to get all the information about our seminars. And in terms of housekeeping, you can submit your questions in the Q&A message board that you see on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I will moderate those together with Tamara today and feed those to the speaker at the end of the talk. So now let's get into the main part of our event. Tamara, would you like to introduce our speaker for today?
Sure, thanks, Agatha. So today we're especially excited to host Dr. Tamarinde Haven. Tamarinde will talk about responsible research practices and the role supervisors play in socializing PhD students into these practices. Tamarinde has a background in psychology, philosophy, and epidemiology. Her PhD thesis was about the role of the research climate in fostering or undermining research integrity. Currently, Tamarinde works at the Aarhus University in Denmark on developing a measurement instrument for responsible supervision. Beyond that, Tamarinde was also a scholar in residence at the Center for Open Science and worked on advancing a pre-registration for qualitative research and developed a pre-registration template for qualitative research through a Delphi study. Very important work. So we're looking forward to listening to Tamarinde. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you both for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to share some of my new work. I want to start off by emphasizing that I did not do this work alone. On this slide, you see research fellow Nicole Hildebrand and student assistant Susan Abonieda, who helped me collect the data that was very crucial for this project. To the right is Martin Holst, who supported me during a pilot study that preceded the results I'll be sharing today. And all the way to the right is Benjamin Carlisle, whose data science skills have been crucial in various steps along the way. I wanted to start off by giving a little bit of background as to how I understand supervision and its relationship with responsible research practice and research integrity. And then I'll say a little bit more about how we nowadays understand the concept of responsible supervision. I'll also emphasize, or I'll go a little bit deeper into the methods we used for a study where we looked at pairs of PhD candidates and supervisors. And I'll give some of the first results, mostly focusing on descriptives, but also a few logistic regression models that I think answer our research questions more directly. And I hope I can close by putting all of that a little bit into context, and that we can together also talk and brainstorm about the role of early career researchers in advancing the knowledge and the normalness, if you will, of responsible research practices in our scientific communities. Now, when we think about research integrity and supervision, this relationship seems to be bi-directional, if you will. On the one hand, it is thought that good or responsible supervision may help socialize more junior researchers or PhD candidates into responsible research. And this is what we often see emphasized in codes of conduct, for example. So the European Code of Conduct emphasizes that supervisors mentor their team and team members and offer specific guidance and training to properly develop, design, and structure their research activity, and to also foster a culture of research integrity. And also some other authors have very already earlier in the beginning of the 2000s emphasized and explored this. On the other hand, of course, there is the idea that insufficient supervision, and that can be both a supervisor being completely absent, or perhaps a supervisor, him or her themselves, engaging in more sort of questionable research practice to game the system of science. Those things could actually undermine research integrity. And this is something where we actually see, and this is part of my PhD work, what we noted was that when you ask researchers about this in a survey, this insufficient supervision, however people understand that, is something that researchers across academic ranks and disciplinary fields at least seem to be quite concerned about. Now, moving on to what then responsible supervision would be, that's a little bit of a challenge because there is no consented definition about what responsible supervision for research integrity should mean. But if you try to synthesize all of the works from authors on the screen, what you find is that there seem to be three main components that return with greater or lesser emphasis in all of these works. The first being that the supervisor is supposed to be a role model. This means that the supervisor, him or themselves, engages in responsible research practices, such as making their own data and code consistently available. And the idea here being that if you work under someone that does that consistently, you are more likely to take up that practice yourself because you simply see it as this is the way we do science around here. The second one is that the supervisor encourages the PhD candidate to engage in responsible research practices. After all, it could be, and in many instances it is, that the supervisor has much more of the coordinating role. They no longer themselves are maybe in the lab every day, but it doesn't mean that they cannot encourage a PhD candidate to do their work responsibly. So here you may think about things like providing a PhD candidate dedicated time for trying to find out what the most suitable repository would be to upload their data to later, and all other sorts of practices. It may also mean that the supervisor actually sits the PhD candidate down and indicates through conversation and debate that particular of these practices are very important. And thirdly, there is the idea that the supervisor is able to create a psychologically safe climate. And that is a climate characterized by the fact that people feel safe to take the risk of asking a question, admitting something went wrong, or maybe challenging the status quo a little bit. Is this really the best way to answer a research question? Do these data allow for these kind of interpretations? And these are things we also really want when we want the quality of our work to be high. Now, in recent years, research into responsible supervision is growing, but I think there are also some remaining knowledge gaps. So Daniel Pizzolato and colleagues did a scoping review where they identified a total of 24 studies on the topic. And the majority of those, about 2/3, regarded surveys where people inquired perceptions, mostly from either PhD candidates or from the supervisors. And something that struck me when reading the scoping review was that even though this role modeling aspect is supposed to be important, there were actually no empirical studies that digged more deeply into this. And it made me and my team wonder if there would be a way possible in which we could study this a little bit more directly. And I want to emphasize from the start that what I'll be now telling you is still going to be a proxy for actual role modeling. I think if we really wanted to see if that was happening, we would have to be able to transform ourselves into little flies on the walls and perhaps observe an entire trajectory unfold. That's not what I did. But me and my team emphasized and thought that maybe, shouldn't it be more likely if you work under a supervisor, say, consistently shares data, then we should expect your PhD thesis to include more publications that also share data. So what we hypothesized here was that we should be more likely to identify responsible research practices in empirical publications that were part of a PhD thesis when the PhD candidate supervisor engaged in these responsible research practices, right? This is where the role modeling component comes back, compared to PhD candidates who had a supervisor who did not, or who rarely engaged in these responsible research practices. Responsible research practices is a very broad category. I will only be focusing on two ones, namely publishing open access and sharing data openly. That doesn't do justice to the entire concept of responsible research practices, but there are two examples. We chose publishing open access because I think, especially in biomedicine, and that's what this study will focus on, it is rather crucial that everyone who wants to read your findings, including those at less wealthy institutions, can actually get access to it. And it also means that new ideas can be disseminating faster, be scrutinized faster, and potentially triggering new research. We chose data sharing because I also think that is an important norm in various research areas. And of course, making data openly available can be helpful both for secondary data analysis, say in a meta-analysis or a systematic review, but also for actually checking if there are questions or concerns about the work, whether the results reproduce. If we run the analyses again, do we find the same findings, which I also think is very important for research integrity. We tried to put together a population, as I alluded to, of pairs of PhD candidates and supervisors. They had to be working in biomedicine, and this means briefly that the publications we included had to be sort of indexed in Medline. We had to be able to find them in PubMed. The researchers had to be affiliated with a Dutch University medical center. This had actually to do with our pilot. We first tried to also include researchers from Germany, but this proved to be much more challenging because we weren't really certain about the comprehensiveness of the open databases that we used. So there were, in the Netherlands, there are 8 university medical centers, and 4 of those had repositories that allowed for the reliable extraction of the kind of data we needed. So those were Leiden, Amsterdam, Maastricht, and Groningen. We sampled between April and June of this year, and this means that what we included were PhD theses that were either defended in early 2022 or in late 2021. And now you may wonder why did you stop at June 30th? Did that just feel right to you? The answer is a little bit more nuanced. We did a small pilot study earlier that year where we included only 30 pairs. And from that, we looked at the correlations we found between the supervisors publishing open access or the supervisors sharing their data and the PhD candidates publishing open access or sharing the data. And we used the correlations in this pilot study as input for a sample size calculation. So if we wanted to, again, identify a correlation of similar size, you can see it's very small, it's only 0.2 for open access, we would have to include 194 pairs of PhD candidate and supervisor. You will see we sampled a little bit more because we expected some of those still to not meet our inclusion criteria, but that is why you see this perhaps surprising date frame. Now, in order to be included in our study, we put some further criteria in place. So, for example, for the PhD candidates publications, first of all, they had to be part of their PhD thesis. Sometimes people also do other work during the time they work on their PhD. But for those other works, it's rather challenging for us to know whether the supervisor was actually present there or whether they could role model. So we excluded those. The publications had to be part of the PhD thesis, the work that the candidate had defended. It also had to regard empirical publications. And this had to do with the fact that we looked at practices like sharing data. So in practice, this meant that we excluded things like reviews or commentaries or more conceptual papers. The works had to be published latest in 2018. This had actually 2 reasons. First of all, I think that the collective attention we're seeing now for practices like publishing open access and sharing data openly is still rather new in the grander scheme of things. And building up a sample with maybe a lot of publications from the early 2000s seemed quite uncharitable for the sort of analysis we wanted to do. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly here, we know that PhD trajectories in the Netherlands tend to always get at least 3 and most often 4 times of dedicated funding to do their work. This would then regard, of course, full-time PhD candidates. So we also set 2018 as a sort of barrier, because sometimes people already did some work during, say, their master's project, and then they take that on in their PhD thesis. But then we still don't really know if that work was done under the supervision of the person we included. So this is why we only included work if they were published latest 2018. They could also, of course, be from 2022, 2021, 2019, but we set a little bit of a limit there. And importantly, the PhD candidate had to be the first sole author. What we then extracted was the DOIs of the relevant publications, the institute where the PhD candidate got their degree from, and the year of the thesis defense. For the supervisor, we see a very, very similar pattern. We went back 1 year earlier, so publications could be published latest 2017. And this had to do with the fact that often in the first year of a PhD, you might not publish already, but you might already be, you're most likely already working together. So taking some of the works from the supervisor there did seem fair. And for the supervisor, we included works where they were either first author or last author, especially in biomedicine. These are the 2 sort of main authorship criteria that also reviewers or assessors often look at. And I would argue it's quite common practice for a supervisor to appear as the last author, but for them to still have had, at least we can reasonably expect them to have had a reasonable say in how that research panned out, where it was published, and how it was published. Here, we always wanted to have at least 3 publications, or at least always more works from the supervisor than from the PhD candidate. And we again extracted the DOIs and also the authorship position here. We ended up with a sample of 211 pairs, resulting in 2,062 DOIs. As you can see, we included works kind of evenly, or pairs kind of evenly from the different institutions. We had 50 from Leiden, 54 from Amsterdam, 52 from Groningen, 55 from Maastricht. And we then assessed our main 2 variables of interest, and we assessed open access using the state to look, and we looked at the status in unpaywall. So we used the unpaywall API to determine in what form an article was out there. And we assessed open data using AltPub. AltPub is a text mining algorithm that was designed to pick up data sharing statements in biomedical research. Now, whether something classifies as open or open access is, again, not something where there is a full consensus in the community. We used the following distinction. We coded work as open if it was available in gold, green, or hybrid form. And we coded works as closed if they were closed, duh. But we also marked, or we also scored works that were available in a bronze way as closed. Bronze often means that the work is out there, but only on the journal website. So it's not possible to download a PDF or to take it away from that particular website. And we still found that to be not very open friendly. So we also coded those as closed. And for AltPub, we indicated if AltPub running through all of our DOIs actually returned an open data statement, then we said, yes, okay, there's a chance that these authors actually shared their data. And when it did not return an open data statement, we indicated no. Now, we knew from AltPub in advance what its sensitivity and specificity rates were, and that was very helpful, but we still wanted to go one step further. So we used this protocol by Evgeny Bobrov and his colleagues, and what this basically meant was that when AltPub returned a statement, we went back to that actual article. We tried to dig it up, we tried to find the statement, we then tried to find the data set it referred to, we inspected the license of that data set, we tried to see if the data set was actually downloadable, and also in what sort of format it was available, because formatting here also matters, and some formats are much less reusable than others. To give you some more information about what our actual sample then looked like, here you can see the prevalences for our 3 factors of interest. So you can see for open access, if you go to the last column, that already about 83% of the works that we included, those were the 2062 DOIs, were available in a form that we classified as open. So that's already quite large. In contrast, if you look at the data sharing statements that AltPub returned, it only returned data sharing statements for about 9% of the articles included in our sample. And when we then scrutinized those and we removed false positives, that was only a little less than 5%. And this came with the following correlations, rather similar to what we found during the pilot. Correlation of 0.24 when it comes to open access, 0.2 for open data, and even a little bit smaller for the manually verified open data. Now, oh, this doesn't go too well, I'm sorry. We then wanted to go one step further because remember, we were interested in whether there was a greater chance of finding a responsible research practice back in the work of the PhD candidate when they worked under a supervisor that also engaged in this particular practice. So here we transformed our data set to the level of the PhD candidate. So remember, we always had at least 2 publications for PhD candidates included. So we sort of clustered those because it's a little bit unfair to treat those as independent. And we then recoded the engagement of the supervisor into covariates, so we could add them as dummies to our logistic regression models. So for open access, say you have a supervisor for whom we had included 8 works. If none of those 8 works were published in a way that we understood as open, we said, okay, they never did it, they got a 0. If, say, up to 4, so 1, 2, 3, or 4 of those works were openly available, we gave them a 1 because we said, well, they sometimes seem to publish open access. And if 5 or more out of those 8 publications were openly available, we gave them a 2, and we said, they seem to publish open access rather often. For open data, because we already knew also from previous research that this is a practice less often adopted typically, we made the distinction a little bit more crudely. So again, say we look at the same supervisor, they had 8 publications. If for any of these 8 publications, they actually shared data, we said, okay, we gave them a 1, they didn't. If none of those 8 publications actually had data that was shared with them, we gave them a 0. And this is then what we found. So maybe first looking at the table for open access, we find that the odds that a PhD candidate with a supervisor who often published open access will publish open access themselves are about 0.8 times the odds that a PhD candidate would publish open access when their supervisor never did. So it is still a positive effect, it's a significant effect, but I would say it's rather small. It seems natural to assume that there are other more important factors in play than just the supervision that determine whether people publish open access. For open data, we see that the odds ratios are a little bit more substantial. So having a supervisor that shared data is associated with 2.09 times the odds to share data when compared to having a supervisor that did not share data. And to my surprise, frankly, we see that this odds ratio grows when we remove all of the false positives. What you also see in that table in the lower right is, of course, that the 95% confidence ratio actually grows quite a bit. And this makes sense because you saw on the previous slide, there was only a little less than 5% of all of the DOIs and all of the papers in our sample that actually shared their data and for whom we could check whether that data was openly out there. But I think it is an important effect nonetheless. If we try to put this into perspective, one of the typical things we may ask ourselves is, okay, but how typical is this, right? You worked with 4 repositories, you worked with PhD candidates and supervisors from the Netherlands. Is this sort of what we see everywhere else? And it's challenging to answer that question because to the best of my knowledge, it hasn't often really been studied in this particular fashion. But what we do know is some other research that tried to look at how prevalent these behaviors were in a much larger population. So, for example, Sergio and colleagues looked at all of biomedicine. So they took all of the publications that were in Medline, that were findable in PubMed, and they found about 8.9% to be available. So we had a prevalence of 8.8. They found 8.9 of all of PubMed to have open data statements. The very nice thing about this comparison is that they used the same text mining algorithm as we did. So when I saw this, it gave me a little bit more confidence that at least for open data, we didn't look at an entirely weird or unique situation when focusing only on PhD candidates and supervisors from these 4 Dutch university medical centers. For open access, it's a little bit different. I tried to, or I'm basing myself here of work by Piwawar and colleagues from 2018. And then this is a very, very interesting and excellent paper, but I'm warning you in advance that the comparison I'm making here is again using our distinction of whether something was open or not. So here, open again, to reiterate, meant it was available in gold or green or hybrid form. And they found that that was, for biomedicine, a little over 30%, whereas we found that to be 83%. So that's quite different. Another thing people often say when I'm talking about my work is that I shouldn't overlook the important role that PhD candidates and early career researchers have in spearheading many of the very important initiatives, and I should have included Riot, of course, here, in promoting responsible research practices and educating the community about it. So I here focused on reproducibility and the open science communities because they are actually rather well attended in the Netherlands. And this raises the further question, which is also relates to a recent paper from Daniel Pizzolato and Chris Diederichs on the question of who is actually teaching or educating who about these responsible research practices. And given that a lot of the education and training that is offered is directed at the level of early career researchers, is it not them? Is it not the early career researcher in this case that is telling their supervisor about how important this is? And my answer is that could very well be. And maybe the truth is something a little bit more in the middle. My work is cross-sectional and it doesn't allow for answering those research questions, although they are very important. But I also think it doesn't necessarily need to conflict with it, because at least in my humble opinion, even if you already know about sharing data how to do that in a fair way, then it may still help to work in a team where others also engage in this kind of behavior. It may help to work under a supervisor that strengthens your belief that this is an important thing to do, that shares that belief, that gives you the time to do that also in a proper way, because a lot of these practices do take time. So I think it doesn't need to conflict with it, but I want to reiterate that I see the important role of early career researchers. What my work focuses on much more is also trying to raise awareness for the important role supervisors have, so that it doesn't become a situation where we dump the full responsibility onto the shoulders of early career researchers who are new in the system and who often still need to meet many milestones before they become established and get a more sustainable position in academia or science more broadly. I want to close on some of the next steps. So I'm working on two different things in this regard. First of all, I'm trying to explore different methods of extending this data set, using more automated harvesting approaches. All of the work and all of the data that I dwelled on today has been extracted by hand, if you will, and I'm happy to walk you through our protocol should you be interested in doing something similar. But that also, of course, means it's challenging to scale that up, especially if you don't have the very wonderful research fellows and student assistants that I have the privilege to work with. Another thing I want to look at is screening the full text for other relevant research practices. So here you may think about open methods, or perhaps acknowledging limitations of the works, or again, focusing on biomedical research, using appropriate reporting guidelines. So these are also some of the things I'm currently grappling with. Should you want to know more, a fuller version of what I talked about today is available as a preprint on Meta Archive. I can put the link in the chat later, or maybe send it to the organizers. And with that, I'm very keen to see if there are any questions that I can answer. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Tamarinde. That was really interesting. It would be great if you could share the link in the chat to the preprint for whoever is interested in sort of looking deeper into the method, the results from your study. And as Tamara said, also in the chat, everybody feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box if you have any questions. And as we let people think about their questions, I was wondering if we could start off the discussion at the sort of very high level of thinking about how you understand responsible research practices, because of course in your study you focused on sharing data and publishing open access, but I can imagine responsible research practices can mean either something much broader, or for some people it actually might mean something very different than sharing data openly or publishing openly. So I was wondering, to sort of play a little sort of devil's advocate, do you think that everybody would agree that that's something we can call a responsible research practice, that we should identify data sharing and publishing open access with research integrity sort of type of practices, in how you would argue for, you know, that this is a responsible research practice and we should look at these types of practices as responsible research practices?
Thanks, that's a very interesting question. And the quick answer is no, I don't think everyone will agree. Now, there's of course the meta question, if we will ever all agree on something in science, and perhaps there is something to be said for productive disagreements. But I thought about this a little bit more, and when starting this work initially, I was also hoping to look more deeply at practices that we associate with research integrity a little bit more closely. And this proved to be notoriously challenging, because the way, and this is something we all know, but you run into really troubles if you're trying to do the work in the way we did. When you focus on publications, you get the crux of not everything people did was written down, and the way something was written down wasn't necessarily the way the research was conducted. I personally think that these related concepts like responsible research practices, transparency, open science are very related, but that we often see when we talk about them, that we give them a slightly different focus. So at least for me, responsible research practices, and which crashes, or which is in clash with what I've talked about today, but I've come to think about it in the following way. I think responsible research practices more often have to do with the way the work was conducted. So this means perhaps practices like, was a statistician consulted to see if the proposed data analytic methods were actually suitable? It may also mean that you have put great time and effort in meticulously tracking your work for any sort of potential errors. It may mean that you have tried to use validated measurement instruments for the type of topics you are investigating. I then think aspects of transparency have much more to do with how something was written up, and the amount of details that you provide that would allow others to get a better assessment of your work. I think that is where some of the strengths of transparency really come to the forefront. And then I think practices like sharing data with publishing open access have much more to do with how we disseminate our work. And it is challenging, I think, to really juxtapose these different concepts like responsible research practices, transparency, open science. I think they interrelate. I also think they should interrelate. But if you ask me what their somewhat unique focus is, because adhering to open science principles may not always mean also being transparent. It may also not always mean that the work is done according to responsible research practices. So I think the unique foci come into play with responsible research practices focusing on the way the work was conducted, transparency focusing on the way the work was reported, and open science really leveraging the way the work was disseminated.
Yeah, I really love that breakdown and that distinction, because I'm also thinking that I can easily imagine cases where research was conducted maybe not in a way that we would define as responsible research practice, but then data was shared and the article has been published open access because, for example, the funders require it, right? So we got funding from, I don't know, EU or a national research council, and we don't have a choice. We have to share data and we have to publish the article openly. But have we conducted the whole research in the manner that we would call the responsible research practice? Who knows, right?
Yeah.
So that can be, these two can be sort of separated, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's important to again emphasize here what we did in this work, especially when we take the example of sharing data, is that we looked at, does a tax mining algorithm even return a statement? Does there seem to be an indication of data is openly shared? And then we went in to see, can we actually find that data? Does it seem to comply with things that loosely associate with the FAIR principles, but it's not necessarily fair, and I can't say that with great certainty. Given the breadth of biomedicine and my humble background in epidemiology, I am not at all qualified to say anything about the relevance and the suitability of the methods by which that data was collected. That is completely out of scope, and I would not be able to say anything meaningful about it. But I fully agree with you that that doesn't necessarily mean, simply because it's open, doesn't mean it's good quality. And I think it's very important that we keep on drawing that distinction, especially when we now move towards an era where I feel some of these practices of openness are much more institutionalized or formalized and seen as requirements. I think that if you have your data openly available, it might allow for a better assessment of whether the data were actually of good quality. But it doesn't mean they were good quality by virtue of being open.
Right. And I'm really happy you're mentioning this algorithm, because that was my next question. Because if I understood correctly, you double checked the cases when the algorithm said, yes, there was a statement that says that the data is shared or data is available. But what about the sort of false negatives, right? So do you think there might have been cases where the algorithm said, no, there is no data availability statement, but maybe data was actually shared somewhere in the text with a link, it was just not picked up by the algorithm? And I asked about that because I was involved in a project where we assessed manually. We really skimmed through manually a bunch of articles looking for indications of available data. And sometimes data is simply not sitting in a availability statement, right? Sometimes data is somewhere, you know, oh, and here is the sort of background material for what we did, right? And then they provide a link, or it's sort of wrapped in the text even more ambiguously, but then you click on the link and like actually there is some material and data that you could classify as open data. So do you think there could have been cases like that you maybe missed?
The simple answer is yes. If I can elaborate a little bit on that, when the developers trained this algorithm, they set it such that there was a much greater chance of false positives compared to false negatives. This also had to do with the purpose for which it was developed, namely one where they wanted to give out prize money for people that made their data openly available. So it was in the interest of their project that they didn't miss things. Might they still miss things? Absolutely. Another thing to clarify is that the way this algorithm works is by actually screening the full text. This may still mean it misses things, absolutely, but I do want to add that information. It wasn't perhaps completely clear from how I told it earlier, but we extracted those DOIs and then also got the full text. And so we fed the full text in a properly formatted way back to the algorithm to screen it. So it did at least have access to that full text. But you are very right that we don't currently live in a day and age where those where the formatting of where open data statements should appear is entirely consistent. It may be for some journals, it may not be for others. We did have access to the full text, so even if it wasn't necessarily appearing where we would normally expect it to appear, we could still find it. But yes, it can obviously mean that we have missed a few things.
Yeah, but at the same time, you maybe might have missed a few things, but then it picked up also, you know, some more things that were actually not really open data the way you would define it. So I think either way, it would be probably within the margin of error, right? And yes, what I meant was that even if you scan the full text, sometimes these availability statements or just these provided links are in places where you wouldn't pick it up by the keywords. For example, if you go by few keywords, you might not pick it up. So that definitely happens, but I also wouldn't say it happens so often that it would completely change your result, right? Like I don't think that would be very.
Yeah, but we definitely at points found statements in weird places, right? They would appear in or a link to the kind of genes that were analyzed for this particular study would appear in the introduction, for example. So those sort of things are, again, not where I would necessarily expect it, but it might also mean that the journal editors even indicated it to be there, right? We won't know. We also had a lot of the other cases. So if you remember from the prevalences, you almost see them being cut in half, right? So still a lot of sort of false positives that surface. And that really had to do with all sorts of things. So sometimes the data was actually findable and it appeared where it had to appear, but then it was still under embargo. So we didn't count those as yes. Sometimes there was almost no information on the license. Those are also challenging cases, right? Then it is out there, but what are you allowed to do with it? We also had cases where people only put their data in the supplementary materials. Those are also challenging, right? It might be in a supplementary materials of a closed access publication, then is it really open? But again, there was a phase where we thought that this might be a good thing to do, right? We actually, following the protocol from protocols.io that I shared earlier on the slide, when things were only in the supplementary materials, we counted them as no. It is the case that there are some publishers that collaborate with repositories so that they automatically get entered to a particular repository. Those we counted as yes. But to have things only in the supplementary materials of a paper is a risky approach. We're not so certain about the sort of stability of the infrastructure behind that. But you do feel it's a little bit of a dilemma for me and for the other extractors, right? Because you do feel, oh, part of the intention was there. But for this, we chose to also code those as no.
Yeah, and those are, of course, the arbitrary decisions you have to make, right? Just as you, with any other research, you just define the scope of your certain concept that you're targeting, or you operationalize your concept. So I think that there is no way around that, right? And there is no other way of doing it. And then I have another sort of burning question, but like if anybody else has questions, just feel free to jump in. But I think the point about who teaches who was really interesting. And I think there might be so many factors there, because the moment you said, okay, so like PhD students are participating in all these initiatives, all these courses are targeted at early career researchers, right? Not really at supervisors. So then how does that dynamic, what is the direction of that dynamic in passing on this sort of eagerness to practice open research? I was also thinking that certain PhD students that already know something or eager to practice open science might be also choosing certain types of supervisors, right? So it might be already in a way biased or decided from the get-go. When I was choosing my my postdoc lab, or the lab that became my postdoc lab, that was a big factor for me. I wanted to learn more about open science, and I chose the lab where I knew they were really good at, data management, pre-registrations, data sharing, and I went there. And of course, necessarily, then both the supervisor and the trainee that shows in our publications, right? But that's not because she modeled my behavior or I modeled her, but I sort of went for that lab because they were already doing it. So like, what do you think about that sort of also potential sort of confound, or how does that agree with the finding?
There are a few factors in play here, right? So the first is that my work is retrospective, and it would of course be fantastic if I also had the sort of information that you are giving me now for all of the pairs in my sample, right? If I'd known them all at the start of their PhD trajectory, and I could actually ask them, oh, to what extent are you interested in open science practices? But this is retrospective. So I think by virtue of the kind of design, I can already not say anything much more meaningful about it. And the other thing you're alluding to is, how do these sort of practices transfer, right? How does socialization really works? And I think that's an entirely, you know, that would mean that we would need very, very different methods also for these sort of things, right? Because even if we were to know, okay, what's maybe your level of competence and familiarity, or to what extent does this matter to you, we still get individual measures. And I think something that we tend to overlook also when it comes to rewarding individuals for particular behaviors they do is, what is the group and the institutional setting that people are finding themselves in? And I really think the practices in a climate and the influence that departmental leaders can have there, or maybe even the resources that an institution has, do influence rather substantially what it is that we can or we cannot do. So I would hope that, and I'm frankly hoping myself to do part of that future research, if we set this up more prospectively, that we also really take the institutional environment as a whole and the department as a sort of smaller unit into account when trying to examine this transferability. Because I think the normalness or the extent to which these practices really become adapted, sure, can be heavily leveraged by powerful individuals moving places, but we shouldn't fully disregard the impact and the influence of the group or the institution that you find yourself in.
Yeah, because of course, students are nested within supervisors, and then supervisors are nested within institutions, and then students are also nested within these institutions through, you know, being in a lab of that particular supervisor. So there is a multi-directional influence there, probably too. But so given that that's, you know, the case, it would be also so interesting to know how much more influence does role modeling of a supervisor has versus how many resources institutions put into training early career researchers in open research and in research sharing, because then, you know, that would be very interesting and useful information for us who are trying to implement these trainings at these different institutions. You know, should we be targeting more supervisors and channeling all these trainings through supervisors, or should we actually be putting more resources into just all these group courses and classes and journal clubs and bottom up initiatives? You know, what should we target to get more effective at, you know, passing on these trainings?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. Part of my work has been to develop these kind of curricula specifically for PhD supervisors. So one of the things we did was developing a training for PhD supervisors from all sorts of disciplines, where we really tried to combine growing or expanding people's interpersonal skills, as well as their sort of knowledge and dexterity with responsible research practices. A related challenge I find there in that field, just as well as when it comes to trainings for PhD candidates or more early career researchers, also has to do with then quantifying the effectiveness of the types of approaches that we are rolling out. What I'm trying to focus on now with my work at Aarhus is developing a measurement instrument where we use both the perceptions, the self-evaluations of the supervisors, and also the perceptions of the PhD candidates from their supervisors, in an attempt of at least sort of using those two sources of information and of actually trying to validate something, so we can say when in the future we would again roll out this superb supervision course that I'm personally involved with, but you can swap in any of your own examples here, whether we actually see a difference there, because that remains very much a challenge. And I'm glad to see that we're seeing some more attention for those questions, but I also feel institutions are fair in demanding to see a little bit stronger evidence before putting all of their resources there and rolling out larger programs, with, of course, the caveat that there are many, many different ways of doing this, and that I would heavily encourage institutions to explore and to experiment with those, but that it is reasonable to also work on building the right kind of materials that can evaluate the effectiveness of the kind of approaches that we are all as a community very enthusiastic about.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I also just wanted to highlight what you said, Tamarinde, because it's really important to that we just maybe can continue putting all the work on the shoulders of early career researchers. So yeah, this is really important implication and of your work. And I'm also wondering, so how do you see the landscape, research landscape, or the climate, research climate in maybe 10 years in terms of involvement of more senior researchers in this in responsible research practices and socializing PhD researchers into them? Difficult question.
Yeah, that's a really tough one. I don't know what to expect. What I can tell you is the hope that I'm having. My sort of reason for waking up, for giving courses to PhD supervisors and whatnot. And it is that I do hope that in 10 years' time, we see a greater normalness in, if the conditions allow it, that we make our data openly available, but that we also see a climate characterized by the kind of safety, so that we really feel that we can also question our superiors, albeit in a respectful way. I think respect and trust are hugely important for science, but sometimes in the current competition, people may be silent about their best or most provocative ideas they're having because they don't feel there really is the space for that. That is also something that I'm really hoping that we're going to see small and incremental changes over the years, and also of leaders becoming a little bit more important and aware and a little bit more involved in the continuous challenge of creating a culture of safety in your group. And that doesn't have to be in a culture where we can say everything and we just chitter-chatter the whole time through. I really mean the kind of safety to put forth a provocative idea without knowing that you will be sort of killed when you put it in discussion. That it may be a sort of science where we can put forth even our sort of craziest ideas, and maybe, 99% of them fail, but that we do harvest all of those ideas, and that we keep on drawing also people into research that have that creative mindset, and that we don't filter them out already at the beginning because they don't fare well in a system characterized by such steep competition.
Yeah, thanks so much. And we're closing in just a minute. We're almost on the top of the hour. But to close up, I was just curious whether you were surprised with the results that you observed, or was it sort of expected? You were just like, oh, okay, this is sort of what we thought we would see.
Oh, this is a great question. When I presented this work to colleagues, they were like, yeah, we kind of expected this. But personally, for me, this was one of the things where I thought, even if I find nothing, I know that, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But even if I find nothing, that is still a weird finding and an interesting finding in its own right. So to be frank, I'm of course very happy to see some of these results, again, with the big emphasis that is only cross-sectional work that I'm presenting today. And they make me a little bit more hopeful to see those numbers. And if I would have not found anything, I think I would still have persevered in this area. It wouldn't have stopped me from exploring the role that supervisors play in fostering responsible research practices. And I think I would have still tried to talk with policymakers to say, what do you think is going on here? Or is this how you would like the status quo of your institution to be?
Plus, these things can also change over time, so that if you look at exactly the same sort of question in, I don't know, 5 years, things maybe will change dramatically, also because the adoption of open research practices is speeding up in certain fields, for example. So maybe that influence of supervisors will also change when the whole landscape of, adopting and implementing these practices will also change.
And department leaders as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So both institutional factors and the sort of global factors and supervision.
Yeah, bottom up and top down processes. I mean, both are really important.
Absolutely. All right, I think it's time to close up our discussion and this webinar. Thank you so much, Tamarinde. I think this is a really important topic that is definitely not being researched enough. So I'm really looking forward to next sort of set of results from your studies in this area. For our Norwegian node of Vrije Science Club, this is the final webinar for this semester, but we'll come back next semester. So keep an eye on the updates, and the recording of this talk will be posted on the Vrije Science Club YouTube channel, so you'll be able to rewatch it there or to share it with those that could be potentially interested in this topic. So thank you so much again, Tamarinde, and thanks so much to everybody for joining today.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.